We are not talking about simple folklore or mythological bedtime stories here. We are talking about the true, terrifying foundation of every single civilization you have ever studied, a history so meticulously scrubbed from the record that its very mention sends convulsions through the highest ranks of the global elite. Can you believe that the entire trajectory of human evolution was not some random biological accident, but a desperate genetically engineered intervention orchestrated by beings we could only classify as highly advanced alien gods? This is the story of the Anunnaki, the ones who came down from the sky, the true hidden architects of our existence, and the figures who hold the terrifying secret of why we are even breathing the air on this planet at all. Close your eyes, but keep your mind acutely awake, because what you are about to hear will fundamentally shatter how you view every sunrise, every ancient ruin, and every single textbook in your history class. For millennia, the official scientific narrative has lured us into a comfortable intellectual slumber, whispering soothing tales of slow, random evolution from the primordial soup, deliberately ignoring the catastrophic truth. We were not born. We were professionally, scientifically made. The journey begins not on Earth, not in the steaming jungles of Africa, but in the deep, cold blackness of space, orbiting a celestial phantom known only to the truly initiated as Nibiru, the rogue world, the massive, dark, legendary 12th planet. Imagine a world whose elliptical orbit is so impossibly vast, so stretched across the cosmic dark, that it spends thousands of years lost and frozen in the void before slingshotting back into the familiar, life-giving warmth of our solar system, bringing with it the seeds of both creation and absolute terrifying destruction. On Nibiru, the inhabitants were anything but primitive. They were galactic masters, technologically superior beyond the wildest, most fantastic dreams of our current century, living lives that spanned multiple human generations. But they were facing an environmental crisis so profound, so devastating, that it threatened to extinguish their entire lineage in a single, silent gasp. Their atmosphere was dying a slow, excruciating death. The critical shield, the life-giving protective bubble that protected them from the brutal, ionizing radiation of space, was failing, slowly eroding like dust in the vacuum, a silent, creeping catastrophe no one saw coming until it was almost too late to formulate a plan of action. They needed gold. Not for trivial jewelry, not for superficial wealth or monetary currency, but for its single, most miraculous, esoteric property. A fine, monotonic, colloidal dust capable of repairing their critically failing atmosphere, a solar shield that could instantly save their dying race from oblivion. And where was the nearest, most abundant, and most easily accessible source of this precious, life-saving element? A lush, blue-green marble hanging innocently, blissfully unaware, in the vastness, Earth. Our home was, to them, nothing more than a cosmic resource depot, a giant metallic mine waiting to be exploited. The executive decision was made at the absolute highest echelon of the Nibirian Council, led by the supreme, terrifying ruler, Anu. A desperate, monumental mission was launched, an interstellar exodus of profound desperation disguised expertly as a divine visitation in the ancient texts. Their immediate goal was chillingly simple: mine the required gold, save their doomed planet, and, if absolutely necessary, subjugate and utilize any primitive life forms they encountered along the way. This was emphatically not a friendly visit. It was an invasion born purely of existential necessity and self-preservation. The exact year they arrived is mercifully lost to human historical records, buried deep beneath layers of geological sediment and deliberately fabricated myth. But the moment of their landing shattered the peaceful silence of the ancient world forever. We are talking about vast, highly sophisticated, mile-long spacecraft, not fragile wooden boats or rudimentary stone structures, descending with earth-shaking force upon the fertile, steaming Persian Gulf region, specifically the rich lands known today as Sumer or Mesopotamia. These beings weren't ethereal, wispy spirits. These were physical, massive beings of immense stature and formidable, overwhelming presence, often described in the foundational Sumerian cuneiform texts as those who from heaven to earth came, the Anunnaki, the true masters. Their appearance was instantly magnified, misinterpreted, and twisted by the small, frightened primitive minds they first encountered. Their powerful, complex tools became instant magic wands. Their immense spacecraft became terrifying, fiery chariots, and their advanced medical technology was instantly seen as miraculous, divine resurrection. They established their first operational command center, Eridu, the home in the faraway, a massive base designed purely for logistics, control, and the efficient extraction of resources, setting the stage for the most brutal, desperate labor project in the history of this cosmic sector. Leading this desperate, grueling, gold-seeking operation were Anu's two immensely powerful sons, bitter rivals whose conflict would define the future of humanity. Enlil, the meticulous, authoritarian commander who demanded instant, unquestioning obedience, and Enki, the brilliant, rebellious scientist, the master geneticist who saw beyond the immediate task. Enlil, whose name literally translates to Lord of Command, was ruthlessly tasked with overseeing the horrifying mining operations, a job he instantly despised. He viewed Earth and its resources as nothing more than a temporary, dirty necessity that offended his noble sensibilities. Enki, however, saw something far greater than dirt and rock. He saw opportunity. He was fascinated, almost magnetically drawn to the nascent, slow-moving hominids roaming the plains, the early ancestors of humanity, creatures who possessed the raw, moldable genetic material for something far greater than themselves. The Anunnaki primary workforce, known as the Igigi, were the frontline miners, the ones doing the soul-crushing, back-breaking, suffocating work deep beneath the surface of the Abzu, the mining region in ancient Africa, tirelessly digging up the gold necessary for Nibiru's ultimate survival. But the Igigi were not mere slaves. They were highly trained, technologically adept soldiers, and their loyalty had severe limits. The workload was unbearable, the equatorial heat oppressive, and the constant stress of the alien environment began to take its rapid, deadly toll on their morale and their bodies. The first, unmistakable sign of the inevitable disaster, the cosmic mutiny that would ultimately lead to our creation, happened violently in the deep, scorching pits of the Abzu, where despair and exhaustion boiled over into open, organized rebellion. Imagine the scene. Thousands of highly trained, technologically advanced beings, the elite of their race, throwing down their sophisticated tools, refusing to work another minute, their guttural shouts of protest echoing across the ancient, silent plains, reaching the very command centers of their leaders. This terrifying rebellion was the pivotal moment, the cosmic bottleneck that forced the Anunnaki leadership to confront an impossible, immediate choice: abandon the gold mission and let Nibiru die, thus ending their race, or find a permanent, replaceable, and disposable workforce. This single crisis, this terrifying, career-ending moment of potential extinction for their own race, is precisely why you are here listening to this story. It forced the ambitious hand of Enki, leading directly to the ultimate, blasphemous genetic experiment, the creation of Lulu, the primitive worker, the prototype man. They needed a slave, yes, but they desperately needed one who could understand complex commands, one who could manipulate tools, one whose conveniently brief lifespan meant they would never possess the collective memory or stability to question their alien masters. And so, in the sterile, high-tech, glowing laboratories of the Anunnaki, utilizing the existing hominid DNA and fusing it meticulously with their own sophisticated, divine genetic code, the successful prototype for modern man was finally formed, born under the sign of necessity and desperation. You are not a random mistake of nature. You are a product of extreme existential necessity, a quick cosmic fix for a failing atmosphere, created in a laboratory under duress, specifically designed to mine vast amounts of gold for distant alien gods. The story of Adam and Eve, the mythical garden, the tempting knowledge, it's all a deeply veiled, fractured memory of this genetic intervention, a whisper of the exact moment when the gods decided to play with the fundamental elements of life on Earth. But the creation was, in the end, catastrophically flawed. It was too successful. The engineered slave race began to quickly acquire things their masters never intended them to possess: knowledge, burgeoning curiosity, abstract thought, and worst of all, the astonishing ability to rapidly self-reproduce. The simmering fear in the Anunnaki Council was now palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. They had inadvertently created a Frankenstein's monster, a race that was breeding too quickly, becoming too smart, rapidly threatening to expose the hidden, existential truth of their entire presence on Earth. The stage is now perfectly set for the greatest cosmic civil war in recorded history, a brutal, unending battle, not just between the estranged brothers, Enlil and Enki, but over the ultimate fate of the slave race they had just engineered into existence. The gold was being gathered. Nibiru was slowly being saved from certain annihilation, but at the irreversible cosmic cost of forever changing the destiny of planet Earth. Our true hidden history is about to be violently unearthed, layer by agonizing layer, in the chapters to come. The destiny of Earth was now hurtling toward its inevitable collision, carried within the colossal radiation-shielded hull of the Anunnaki fleet, a desperate ark fleeing the spectral death of Nibiru. This was not a voyage of exploration. It was a frantic, catastrophic flight for survival, spanning unimaginable distances and fueled by the fading hope of a dying civilization. Every single soul aboard knew the terrifying stakes. If they failed to harvest the gold, not only would Earth become their tomb, but their entire homeworld would choke and vanish in the void. They were led by the king, Anu, but the actual brutal management of the mission fell upon the shoulders of his two most formidable sons, whose rivalry would tear apart the history of this fragile blue planet. Enlil, the rigid, militaristic commander, and Enki, the brilliant but often rebellious chief scientist and engineer. Enlil represented the law, the absolute authority of Nibiru, viewing the mission as a strict extraction operation where no deviation from the decree was acceptable, a harsh disciplinarian whose presence chilled the very atmosphere. Enki, however, saw the potential of this raw, untamed world they were approaching, known to them simply as Ki, or Tiamat. He was the pragmatic intellectual, the master geneticist who understood that survival required adaptation, perhaps even radical experimentation, a perspective that immediately clashed violently with his older brother's orthodox rule. Their initial target was the deepest point of Tiamat's immense gravitational pull, a place that would later be known as the Persian Gulf, the cradle of civilization, a swampland ready to be brutally reshaped into a functional base. The moment of atmospheric penetration was chaotic, a screaming descent through gales of primordial storms and volcanic ash, the fleet scattering like metallic debris before finally finding purchase in the fertile, watery lowlands of what we now call Sumer. They established their first operational outpost, Eridu, the home in the faraway, built literally upon the marshlands, a monumental effort led by Enki to drain the swamps and create the infrastructure necessary for a command center. This base was the nerve center of Project Gold, and it was quickly revealed why the gold on Earth was so critical and why its procurement demanded such extreme measures. It was not merely metallic gold they needed, but a refined, alchemical powder known as monatomic gold, or ormus. This substance, existing in a higher state of matter, possessed extraordinary superconductive and atmospheric repairing properties that regular terrestrial gold could never achieve, requiring complex, heavy-duty mining and refining processes under unimaginable pressure. The initial wave of Anunnaki workers, known as the Igigi, were immediately dispatched to the mining zones, the Abzu, located deep within the unforgiving, scorching terrain of South Africa, where the densest concentrations of this specific gold were detected. But these noble, highly advanced beings, accustomed to the controlled environment and long lifespan of Nibiru, were utterly unsuited for the relentless, grinding, physical torment of early Earth's climate and the sheer depth of the required excavations. The heat was crippling, the geological instability terrifying, and the air, though breathable, was heavy and thick, crushing the highly sophisticated bodies of the Igigi, who began to buckle and fail under the strain of the colossal undertaking. Weeks turned into months of abysmal returns, as morale plummeted faster than the gold levels rose. The Igigi, the worker class, were dying or simply refusing to work, their bodies ravaged by diseases and fatigue that their hyper-advanced medicine could barely combat. Enlil, the commander, responded with typical military brutality, demanding stricter quotas, applying harsh punishments, and enforcing absolute adherence to the mission timeline, driving his people to the point of outright mutiny, a terrifying development that threatened the entire mission's viability. His perspective was simple and cruel. Failure meant the death of Nibiru, so the individual suffering of the Igigi was irrelevant. They must simply endure the impossible or perish trying. But Enki, watching the escalating crisis and the sheer inefficiency of using his own high-born people for such backbreaking rudimentary labor, began to formulate a dangerous, utterly unauthorized plan, a genetic gamble that only a scientist of his profound yet reckless genius could even conceive. He saw the existing primitive hominids on Earth, the crude, tool-using bipeds, the Homo erectus, who were perfectly adapted to the planet's harsh conditions, robust and tireless, but lacking the necessary intelligence for complex instruction. A dark, desperate idea blossomed in his mind. Why mine the gold yourself when you could engineer an entirely new species, a subservient, short-lived worker perfectly designed for the specific purpose of suffering and labor, a creature exempt from the high status of the Anunnaki? This would solve the labor crisis instantly, but it would violate every single natural law and every sacred decree laid down by King Anu, permanently tainting the natural evolution of this pristine, young planet. The whispers of discontent from the Igigi solidified into a massive, terrifying uprising. In the Abzu, the deep mines of southern Africa, the workers threw down their picks, refusing to descend into the scorching hellholes one more time, their collective cry of despair echoing across the continent, reaching Eridu as a direct threat to the entire chain of command. This was the infamous mutiny of the Igigi, the moment of ultimate crisis that forced the hands of the gods and gave Enki the devastating leverage he needed to proceed with his forbidden, terrifying experiment. With the gold supply halted and the fate of Nibiru hanging by a thread, Enlil, the staunch traditionalist, was forced into a desperate, unwilling corner, staring down the barrel of extinction, and realizing that only a radical, terrifying solution could save his people. It was time for Enki to present his blueprint, a genetic monstrosity disguised as salvation, the creation of the Adamu, the primitive worker, the being that would eventually become the foundation of all humankind, but only after a painstaking, agonizing, and highly contested process of cosmic crossbreeding. The laboratory was prepared, the genetic material gathered, and the stage was set for the ultimate betrayal of natural order. A scientific hubris that would forever haunt the memory of the cosmos, initiating the true, blood-soaked history of our lineage. The manipulation was about to begin, not in a calm, sterile lab, but in a chaotic, desperate military installation, driven by the ticking clock of a dying world, where the very concept of humanity was nothing more than a desperate footnote in an interstellar crisis. The moment had arrived to weave the DNA of the celestial refugee with the crude strands of the terrestrial ape, forging a slave species designed for toil and oblivion, utterly unaware of its own divine, yet tragic, origin. The genetic firestorm had subsided, leaving behind a smoking crater of biological impossibility. What Enki and Ninhursag had wrought in their hidden, sterile laboratories beneath the unforgiving equatorial sun was not a child, but a tool, a creature engineered for endurance, pain, and the singular, terrifying purpose of digging into the Earth's poisoned heart for gold. This first generation, known simply as the Lulu, or primitive worker, took its first gasping breath not in paradise, but in a pressurized, terrifying environment of cosmic desperation. They were not born free. They were decanted into servitude. Their bodies were strong, their minds deliberately primitive, optimized solely for the cyclical rhythm of the pickaxe and the hauling of heavy ore. The Anunnaki watched their creation with a cold mixture of scientific pride and moral revulsion, knowing they had shattered the prime directive of their ancient civilization just to keep Nibiru from dissolving into cosmic dust. The vast, sprawling operation quickly intensified. The Anunnaki established their command and control hub, the infamous Eden, the place of the righteous ones, a complex often romanticized as a lush garden, but which was in reality a meticulously managed industrial slave colony. Here, the gold was processed, refined, and prepared for its long, desperate journey back through the cosmos. Enlil, the chief executive and commander of the Earth mission, ruled the Eden with an iron fist forged in interplanetary panic. Every ounce of gold was measured against the fading hope of his homeworld. He saw the Lulus not as living beings, but as fungible units of labor, easily replaced, utterly disposable. But the scale of the required labor was monumental, crushing even the celestial backs that were supposed to be supervising the operation. The Anunnaki soldiers, those highly trained, technologically advanced beings, were now relegated to grueling overseer duty, managing shifts in the deep, dangerous mines of the Abzu, the southern region of the African continent. They had traded their thrones for the dusty, oppressive heat of the Earth's crust, and the resentment began to bubble like molten lava. The Igigi, the lower-tier Anunnaki who handled the orbital stations, logistics, and most of the heavy supervisory work, found themselves sinking into an unbearable routine of back-breaking toil. They were immortal beings, forced to live the dreary, dangerous life of a mortal miner, constantly exposed to radiation and the crushing weight of the subterranean world. The creation of the Lulu had only slightly lessened the burden. It had not eliminated the Anunnaki's necessity for continuous, grueling oversight. The breaking point arrived. Swift and terrifying, ripping apart the fragile order Enlil had desperately tried to maintain. It was a cosmic labor strike, a mutiny that echoed across the desolate plains of the Eden and shook the very foundations of the Anunnaki settlements. One harrowing night, the Igigi descended from their orbital posts and marched upon the administrative centers. They laid down their heavy tools, not gently, but with a violent, resounding crash that signaled the end of obedience. They gathered in the desolate, dusty square, their celestial armor shimmering in the moonlight, and they set their instruments on fire. The flames licked at the sky, a signal of open rebellion. "The toil is too great," they roared, their voices amplified by advanced acoustic devices, echoing the profound exhaustion of ages. "We will not endure this endless servitude. We will not trade our immortality for the dust of this savage world." Enlil, absolutely apoplectic, watched the inferno of insubordination from his command center. He immediately called for brutal military suppression, demanding that the ringleaders be captured, executed, and made an example of. The entire mission, the last hope of Nibiru, teetered on the brink of catastrophic collapse. But Enki, the scientist and the architect of the Lulu, intervened, his voice calm yet heavy with the weight of consequence. He understood the Igigi's plight. They were his kin, trapped by necessity. He pleaded for diplomacy, seeing an opportunity to solve two problems with one terrible innovation. Enki reminded Enlil that the Igigi's refusal proved the Lulu were necessary, but also fundamentally insufficient. The Lulus were too crude, too mindless to operate independently, always requiring the watchful eye of an Anunnaki supervisor. The Igigi rebelled because they despise the work, Enki stated, his eyes fixed on the raging fires of the burning tools. The Lulu only perform the work because they are incapable of independent thought. If we can refine the Lulu, make them capable of self-management, self-replication, and even simple reasoning, we free both ourselves and the Igigi. This was the proposal that sealed humanity's fate, a concept far more dangerous than the initial creation. Bestow upon the slave race the very consciousness and complexity that allowed the masters to rebel. It was a calculated risk, a desperate, immoral gamble to stabilize the gold production. Enlil, faced with total mission failure, reluctantly agreed. The Lulus needed an upgrade, a second genetic manipulation that would lift them from mere beasts of burden to something terrifyingly closer to the gods themselves. This enhancement would be the introduction of Shimu, the life wind, the spark of divine consciousness, the true and final ingredient in the human tragedy. This meant tearing open the biological contract once more, forcing the Lulus into the sterile, unforgiving labs, and infusing them with a larger, more complex fraction of the Anunnaki's own magnificent, doomed DNA. The result would be a creature capable of independent decision-making, capable of managing the minds, and, most chillingly, capable of eventually questioning its own existence and its master's right to rule. The scientific atrocity was set to resume, moving from the creation of the worker to the creation of the thinker, thereby sowing the seeds of every future conflict, every great war, and every profound tragedy that would ever stain the annals of Earth history. The experiment, which was supposed to be a temporary, high-stakes solution, had succeeded with a speed that shocked even the genius minds of Enki and Ninmah. The primal scream of the first genetically engineered human echoed across the sterile chambers of the House of Life, a terrifying sound that marked the true beginning of our history and the definitive end of planetary peace for the Anunnaki. This creature, the Lulu Amelu, or the mixed man, was a marvel of bioengineering, possessing the robust stamina required for the brutal mining pits of the Abzu, yet retaining the crucial higher cortical functions necessary to follow complex, multi-step instructions without constant supervision. They were, ostensibly, the perfect biological machine, fueled by a desperation instilled not by their own will, but by the very essence of their manufactured existence, designed for singular, grueling purpose. But perfection, as the old cosmic adage warns, often breeds its own brand of unforeseen catastrophe. Enki, driven by boundless scientific curiosity and perhaps a touch of defiant pride, had given the Lulu more than mere stamina. He had given them a spark, that crucial element of awareness that separated them forever from the simple, beast-like hominids they were derived from. Lord Enlil, the commander of the Earth mission, watched this burgeoning workforce with cold, escalating suspicion from his great command center in Nippur, the sacred place known as the Duranki, the symbolic link between heaven and earth. He had explicitly sanctioned the creation of a controllable tool, a temporary solution to the labor crisis, not a potential rival or a population of thinkers, and he saw in their increasingly intelligent, questioning eyes the seeds of rebellion already germinating in the fertile earth soil. The sheer number of Lulus was rapidly growing. They were cloned and reproduced in staggering batches in the Beat Shimti, House of Destiny, rushed into existence to meet the ever-increasing quotas of gold dust required to save the dying planet Nibiru. These newly minted workers were immediately shipped south to the perilous Abzu, the deep, dark mines where their manufactured lifespans were intentionally short and their existence brutal. A disposable, desperate army deployed against the tyranny of cosmic time. The tension between the great brothers, Enki and Enlil, became a palpable, atmospheric pressure hanging over the entire operation, a rift that would define every subsequent conflict on Earth. Enki was the creator, the reckless inventor, the benevolent if deeply flawed father figure who saw the Lulus as his intellectual children, a testament to his genetic mastery. Enlil was the taskmaster, the general, the rigid executor of the law who saw them only as dangerously necessary cannon fodder, a means to an end that had to be controlled with iron discipline and strict adherence to the initial, limiting parameters. This philosophical divide was soon breached by a technicality, a dire, practical need that demanded further transgression. The Anunnaki realized quickly that constant, centralized cloning was proving too slow, too resource-intensive, and too costly for the required scale of population growth. If they were to truly populate the mines and fill the transport ships fast enough, a faster, more sustainable, and decentralized method of reproduction was desperately required. It was a decision fraught with existential peril, a direct violation of the primary control mechanisms Enlil had demanded be implemented into the genetic code. Yet, Enki, ever the pragmatist and the ultimate rebel against his brother's rigid rules, decided to implement the ultimate, catastrophic upgrade. He would secretly grant them the power of natural, sexual reproduction. This singular act, mythologically veiled for millennia as the story of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, the Eden, the sacred plain where the Anunnaki first settled, was nothing less than the clandestine reprogramming of humanity's core operating system. The knowledge of how to multiply, to replicate outside the sterile, controlled oversight of the gods, was suddenly and irreversibly unlocked in the human psyche. The consequences of granting humanity the ability to self-replicate were immediate, terrifying, and mathematically exponential. The Lulas, now equipped with biological imperative and the drive to multiply, began to breed at a rate that dwarfed the most pessimistic projections of the Anunnaki planning commissions. The workforce was no longer a controllable, manageable commodity maintained in the Abzu. It was a biological flood. The silence of the pristine, newly terraformed Earth, which the Anunnaki had intended to preserve as their serene, temporary refuge, was shattered completely. The clamor of thousands upon thousands of human workers, their ceaseless demands, their mating calls, their rapidly evolving rudimentary languages, their sheer chaotic existence became an unbearable noise in the rarefied atmosphere of the heavens. Enlil, whose greatest cosmic desire was order, silence, and absolute obedience, found himself constantly bombarded by the incessant, grating static rising up from the rapidly expanding human settlements below. It was a buzzing, chaotic hum that violated the divine sanctity of his rest and mocked his attempts at maintaining absolute control. He began to furiously petition the assembly of the gods, the high council known as the Igigi, demanding immediate, drastic measures to curb this biological pollution. The necessary gold was flowing, yes, the mission was succeeding, but at what terrible psychological cost to the peace of the gods themselves? The humans were multiplying like an invasive species. They were consuming resources beyond their initial limited mandate, and worse, they were beginning to look up at the stars and ask complex existential questions. They were remembering fragments of the process of their creation, the deep, inconvenient truth they were never meant to access. Enlil's voice, usually a measured boom, cracked with barely suppressed rage across the council chambers. "The noise is too great. Their numbers must be reduced. We must wipe clean this failed chaotic experiment before they grow strong enough to turn their hands against their masters and destroy the entire operation." But Enki, the proud, protective creator, fiercely defended his burgeoning, chaotic children, arguing that they were now absolutely essential to the survival of the Anunnaki themselves, locked in a cycle of dependency that could not be broken without total annihilation. The creation was a success, but its very success became the Anunnaki's greatest terror. These new creatures, the Lulu, did not merely reproduce, they exploded across the Fertile Crescent like an uncontrolled biological wildfire, multiplying faster than any census tablet could track. Their sheer numbers were an immediate, crushing burden on the delicate logistical framework of the gold extraction project, demanding exponentially more resources, more food, and more oversight. The initial relief that swept over the elders of Nibiru quickly curdled into a cold, paralyzing dread. They had solved the labor problem, yes, but they had inadvertently unleashed a biological imperative that threatened to consume the entire colony from the inside out. Enlil, the commander, watched the burgeoning settlements swell from functional labor camps into sprawling, chaotic cities of mud and sweat, his paranoia mounting with every passing cycle. He saw not useful servants, but a restless, highly efficient army that could, at any moment, pivot its focus and turn its collective rage upward toward its divine masters. It was the fear of the uncontrollable mass that drove Enlil to establish the absolute, terrifying boundaries of the New World Order. He decreed a system of total surveillance and martial law, isolating the new human settlements into tightly controlled zones surrounding the central mining operation in the Abzu, the deep south of Mesopotamia. Each city was a fortress of exploitation, designed not for comfort or cultural growth, but for peak labor yield, ruled by meticulously selected lower-caste Igigi overseers who reported directly to the High Council in Nippur. This was the cradle of civilization, twisted. Not a natural growth of human innovation, but a highly engineered, brutal prison camp designed to maximize gold output and minimize dissent. The Anunnaki established their own magnificent, terrifying cities, Eridu for Enki, Lagash, Shuruppak, not as administrative hubs, but as the visible, unchallengeable thrones of godhood. Monuments meant to crush the human spirit beneath the weight of their impossible celestial power. This was the precise moment the true genius and true horror of Ninti and Enki's genetic manipulation was revealed. They had engineered the Adamu not merely for strength and obedience, but with deliberate, catastrophic biological flaws that ensured their perpetual servitude. The Anunnaki possessed lifespans measured in hundreds of thousands of terrestrial years, their cell regeneration a masterpiece of cosmic engineering powered by the unique cyclical atmosphere of Nibiru. But the Lulu, they were given a biological time limit, a brutal, engineered expiration date that ensured no single worker could live long enough to amass significant institutional memory, or, crucially, pass down the full, forbidden truth of their origins across generations. This limited lifespan was the ultimate leash, the short circuit designed to prevent the slave race from ever achieving true generational continuity and challenging the hierarchy. It was a cruel irony. They were created to save the gods from extinction, but they were manufactured with mortality woven directly into their DNA, ensuring their own rapid demise after a meager handful of decades. This swift turnover meant constant retraining, constant psychological resetting, and a perpetual state of exhausting, frantic dependence on the immortal gods. But it maintained the critical power imbalance necessary for the Anunnaki dictatorship to survive. However, even the best-laid plans of the gods fracture under the pressure of messy, chaotic biological reality. The Igigi, the lower tier of Anunnaki who had performed the initial grueling labor, were now tasked with the even more grueling work of managing these millions of short-lived, demanding Lulus. The Igigi found themselves marooned on this sweltering, unforgiving planet, surrounded by the creatures they deeply resented, creatures who were simultaneously dependent and potentially volatile. These Igigi were the frontline managers, the ones suffering the endless heat, the constant administrative burden, and the mental fatigue of managing a slave population whose needs were endless. Their initial resentment against Enlil for forcing them into the mines now transferred, magnified tenfold, onto the Lulus themselves. The tension between the frustrated, isolated Igigi and the rapidly growing, increasingly conscious Lulus became a pressurized fault line running directly beneath the entire gold operation. They started to mingle, to blend, to break the fundamental rule set down by Enlil, the absolute segregation of the divine and the created. This dangerous, forbidden fraternization, the mingling of the Igigi and the daughters of Adamu, was the first true act of cosmic rebellion that the human world would witness, an escalation of the crisis that threatened to unleash an even greater, more catastrophic power struggle than the one that had initially brought the Anunnaki to Earth. Enlil, miles away in his magnificent temple, sensed the shifting, unholy alliance developing in the outlying settlements. He saw the strict lines of divine authority blurring, the pure bloodlines of Nibiru being tainted by the quick-dying, genetically impure stock of Earth. He knew that if this fraternization was not stopped immediately, the entire project, the entire desperate mission to save Nibiru, would collapse into a mongrelized, uncontrollable anarchy, where the slaves might soon forget the meaning of the chains that bound them, and the gods would lose the right to command. The stage was set for the next divine intervention, one that would make the initial creation look like a gentle morning dew. Enlil began to prepare the ultimate solution to the problem of a successful creation, total, catastrophic reset. He prepared for the flood. The terrible silence in the great assembly hall was more deafening than any explosion. Enlil, the Lord of Command, stood like a statue carved from wrath itself, his eyes burning with the rigid certainty of ancient law. The problem was no longer just the gold production, the problem was the Lulu themselves, the human worker class that Ea had so carelessly, so successfully designed. They were too many, too noisy, too chaotic. their relentless, multiplying presence interfering with the sacred frequencies required for the deep atmospheric mining operations. They were a successful creation that had become a biological plague, contaminating the purity of the Anunnaki enterprise. Enlil declared that the genetic experiment had failed, not because the humans could not work, but because they could not be controlled. The solution, already prepared, was the ultimate cosmic reset, the Great Flood, utilizing the predictable catastrophic return of Nibiru. The council gathered, the 12 great figures of the star travelers, and Enlil forced upon them the terrifying, unbreakable oath of silence. No word, no hint, no gesture could be made to the humans regarding the impending disaster. To speak would be to invoke immediate oblivion, a deletion from the very records of Nibiru. The stakes were existential. If the Lulu knew they were doomed, they might riot and destroy the precious gold stockpiles before the tidal wave arrived, ruining the millennia of work and dooming the homeworld. The secret of the coming destruction had to remain sealed, locked away in the high chambers of the orbiting ships. But there was a fracture in the resolve, a desperate rebellion stirring in the heart of the chief scientist, the creator himself, Lord Enki. He had molded these creatures with his own hands. He saw their crude, magnificent potential, and he could not abide the genocide ordered by his zealous half-brother. Ea was bound by the oath, his tongue chained by cosmic law. But his engineering mind sought a loophole, a meticulous, semantic escape route. He could not speak to the man, but he could certainly speak near the man, allowing the wind and the architecture to carry the terrible prophecy. He chose Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, also known as Utnapishtim, a diligent, loyal servant, a man who listened closely to the murmurs of the divine. Ea crept to Ziusudra's reed hut near the Euphrates, and instead of addressing the sleeping man, he addressed the flimsy wall itself. "O wall, I speak to you. Reed screen, heed my words," he whispered, his voice resonating through the mud and reed structure, allowing Ziusudra to hear the terrifying blueprint. The instructions were precise, mathematical, and utterly insane. Build a vessel, not a boat, but a cube, a perfect submersible ark, sealed with pitch, capable of resisting the collapse of the skies and the upheaval of the earth. Ziusudra was commanded to dismantle his entire known world, to gather the seeds of all living things, the genetic heritage of every beast and plant, and bring them into the suffocating darkness of the cube. The cover story was critical. He had to tell his neighbors that he was building this bizarre vessel as a ritualistic offering to the water god, a strange act of penance and devotion. This massive, desperate lie was the only way to avoid the immediate, preemptive wrath of Enlil's guards. Ziusudra, trembling with a fear that transcended mere mortal terror, labored day and night, hauling the colossal timbers, sealing the vessel with bitumen, racing against a cosmic clock he could not see, only feel in the shifting, nervous air. The countdown began not in hours, but in the orbital mechanics of Nibiru. As the colossal planet approached its closest point of perigee, its immense gravitational field began to shear violently across Earth's surface. The first sign was the planetary madness. The atmospheric pressure dropped, the winds screamed, and the magnetic fields warped under the extraterrestrial stress. The earthquakes came next, deep, grinding tremors that cracked the stones of the great Anunnaki landing sites and turned the fertile soil into shifting slurry. The sky darkened, not merely with clouds, but with a condensation of unprecedented mass, moisture pulled down by the crushing gravity of the incoming star travelers home. When Enlil finally gave the absolute command for the reset, a chilling signal broadcast to the orbiting Igigi forces, Ziusudra was just applying the final seal. He pushed the last of the confused animals and his own terrified family into the ark, locking the massive door just moments before the sky truly broke open. The Anunnaki fleet ascended swiftly, their silver ships piercing the atmosphere, retreating to their secure orbital stations to watch the destruction from above. They saw not rain, but a sudden, violent deluge. The simultaneous collapse of the planetary ice sheets, the gravitational shifting of tectonic plates, and the breaking of the subterranean firmament. It was a cosmic cannonade, water rising not gradually but in colossal, mountain-sized tidal waves swept inland, swallowing the nascent cities of Sumer in a single crushing blow. The screams of the millions of Lulu, the failed experiment, were instantly extinguished, their sophisticated genetic structures pulverized by the indiscriminate power of the ultimate cosmic cleansing, leaving behind only the vast, churning, silent ocean. Even Enlil, watching from the safety of the heavens, was momentarily stunned by the sheer violence of the water's wrath. He had ordered the reset, but the fury of the unleashed planetary dynamics was beyond even the manipulation of the greatest Anunnaki commander. He watched the world he had sought to control turn into a featureless, terrifying blue sphere, a perfect grave for the mistakes of creation. The waters had receded, but the silence that followed the deluge was an oppressive, heavy blanket, louder than the roaring storm itself. What was left of Ki, the earth, was a muddy, poisoned wasteland, a sickening brown and gray testament to the unpredictable fury of the cosmos they had tried to tame. Enlil, commander of the mission, stood on the muddy plateau, the command vessel resting nearby, and his eyes were burning with pure, unadulterated fury. He had sought annihilation. He had believed that wiping the slate clean was the only way to safeguard Nibiru's future, even if it meant sacrificing the messy, genetically compromised workers, the Lulu Amalu, he so deeply despised. But even in this catastrophic victory, there was only crushing defeat, a hollow echo that magnified the desperation clinging to their mission. The gold mines were not just damaged, they were ruined, buried under mountains of impenetrable silt and debris, and the colossal infrastructure that had taken millennia to build was simply gone. The mission was back to square one, but now fueled by a panicked urgency, a desperation that was rapidly consuming the calculated ambition that had defined their arrival. The very survival of their homeworld hinged on this recovery, and Enlil knew they were failing. The weight of billions of lives on Nibiru pressed down on him, turning his rage into an incandescent pressure he could barely contain. Then came the sickening, gut-wrenching realization of betrayal. As Enlil surveyed the wreckage, trying to map out a strategy for impossible recovery, Enki, the chief scientist and genetic architect, stepped forward, his face etched with exhaustion and defiance, but also a quiet pride. He admitted it, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He had deliberately, knowingly defied the Council's decree of mass termination. He had refused to allow his creation, his magnificent hybrid workers, to perish in a meaningless, watery grave. Enki had chosen one family, the line of Ziusudra, the righteous one, the man later known to our history as Noah, and secretly guided them, giving them the precise mathematical and architectural knowledge required to build the great seaworthy vessel. This was not merely insubordination, this was high treason against the ruling body of Nibiru, a direct, egregious challenge to the sacred authority of the great god Anu himself. The argument that erupted between the brothers Enlil and Enki was a metaphysical earthquake that shook the very foundations of the drying plains, a primal clash of ideology, order versus compassion, necessity versus creation. Enlil saw Ziusuda and his remaining kin as a dangerous remnant of a flawed experiment that needed immediate, final termination. Enki saw them as the last, fragile hope for their dying homeworld, a resource too valuable to discard. But rage and ancient rivalry could not solve the immediate, crushing crisis of the gold dust shortage. The critical need for monatomic gold, the crucial atmospheric repair agent shielding Nibiru, was exponentially more intense now. The clock was ticking faster than ever, its gears grinding toward planetary oblivion. They needed the refined material yesterday. The destroyed infrastructure meant they couldn't just restart the deep shaft mining operations. They needed a new approach, a faster, more centralized method of control over the few surviving humans that Enki had salvaged. This terrifying reality forced a terrible, pragmatic, and deeply unstable alliance between the warring brothers. They would utilize Ziusudra and his descendants to jumpstart civilization, not as simple mine laborers, but as builders of organized, tribute-paying cities dedicated to the glory of the gods, cities that would centralize the extraction, refining, and delivery process of the desperately needed gold. This was the true, dark birth of civilization as we know it. A desperate, forced utility, engineered for the survival of alien refugees, not for the elevation of mankind. The Anunnaki descended once more to the plains of Mesopotamia, the fertile crescent that was slowly drying out into the only habitable land remaining. They established the first post-flood operational center, Eridu. Under the immediate, intense guidance of Enki, Eridu became the epicenter of the New World Order, swiftly teaching Ziusudra's line the fundamental skills of advanced agriculture, complex astronomical observation, and the crucial tool of cuneiform writing. But this knowledge was never a gift of benevolence. It was a tool of absolute, surgical control. By teaching them to farm, they ensured a stable, abundant food supply for the Anunnaki supervisors who could not hunt or forage like primitives. By teaching them to write, they created an irrefutable ledger system for tracking production, resources, and the sacred tribute. This was the genesis of the divine kingship, the ultimate system of proxy governance. The Anunnaki could not be everywhere at once, managing every field and every forge, so they installed human intermediaries, the first mortal kings, who would rule in the name of the gods. These kings were nothing more than highly placed, genetically loyal foremen, tasked with ensuring the efficient, unending flow of tribute, mostly gold and other vital resources, back to the Anunnaki headquarters. The system was genius in its terrifying simplicity: rule through proxy, control through enforced, religiously absolute worship. As humanity multiplied rapidly, a direct, intended result of the successful genetic programming for hyper-reproduction, the needs and demands of the Anunnaki expanded exponentially. New cities sprang up like forced blossoms: Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. Each city was a dedicated industrial complex, governed by a specific Anunnaki supervisor and his appointed terrestrial king, creating a rigid, militaristic structure of belief. Enlil, though disgusted by the continued existence of the Lulu, took grim charge of the broader organizational structure, establishing strict territorial boundaries. He wanted the humans contained, manageable, and kept far away from the incredibly advanced technological secrets of the true gods. But humanity, once given the essential spark of knowledge by the defiant Enki, proved difficult, if not impossible, to contain. They began to communicate across their artificial boundaries, their shared language, the Proto-Sumerian tongue taught by Enki, serving as a powerful, unifying, and unauthorized force. This unification led inexorably to the most dramatic challenge to Anunnaki authority since the Deluge itself: the collective, ambitious decision to build a structure that would deliberately reach the heavens. A tower that would allow them to bypass their assigned tyrannical supervisors and communicate directly with the highest echelon of the gods, the infamous, audacious Tower of Babel. This sheer audacity, this unauthorized reach for divine parity, was the ultimate existential threat to the carefully constructed hierarchy of control. It proved that the genetic programming for subservience was rapidly failing, and the Anunnaki knew, with icy dread, that they had to act decisively before the humans became fully aware of their true, terrifying status as nothing more than sophisticated, gold-digging slaves. The dreadful realization that the Lulas, the genetically engineered workers, were developing self-awareness hit the Anunnaki high command like a meteor strike. Discipline was fraying, productivity plummeting, and the terrifying silent question of, "Why are we here?" was starting to echo through the gold mines of the Abzu. This was the ultimate betrayal of the scientific mandate. Enki had created a worker, but in doing so, he had accidentally sparked a spirit, a soul, a concept that had no place in their calculated, sterile mining operation. The entire planetary project was teetering on the brink of chaotic collapse, threatening to strand the Anunnaki refugees millions of miles from their dying home. Immediate, drastic action was required, and this crisis split the Divine Council, the assembly of the gods, into two fiercely warring camps, each reflecting a core aspect of the Anunnaki psychology: the ruthless pragmatist versus the empathetic creator. Leading the call for total eradication was the mighty Lord Enlil, commander of the Earth mission. His voice, usually a calm thunder, was now a whip of pure rage in the council chambers. He argued that the contamination was irreversible. The genetic code had been sullied not only by the accidental awakening of consciousness, but, far worse in his eyes, by the increasing instances of Anunnaki males, the Igigi laborers, the lesser gods, intermingling and breeding with the human females. These Nephilim, these hybrid offspring, were an affront to the purity of Nibiru's bloodline and a direct challenge to the established hierarchy. Enlil saw only one solution, harsh and absolute: a total, catastrophic reset. He proposed letting the inevitable geological catastrophe, which their own planet Nibiru's return orbit was causing, run its course, extinguishing the entire burgeoning human population and starting the labor project anew, perhaps with a less intelligent model next time. His brother, Enki, the Lord of Wisdom and the chief scientist, stood opposed, his heart heavy with the realization that he had fallen in love with his own creation. He could not, would not, allow the complete destruction of his complex, beautiful work, even if it was fundamentally flawed from a labor standpoint. Enki knew the environmental signs were not merely warnings. They were an imminent death sentence for anything living on the lower planes. Nibiru's gravitational pull was already beginning to tear at Earth's fragile crust, causing oceanic thermal expansion, destabilizing the Antarctic ice sheet, and creating immense planet-scouring tidal forces. The Great Deluge, the Abu-Bu, was coming. Enlil intended to use this natural cosmic event to solve his problem without lifting a finger, ordering every Anunnaki not to warn the human population, letting the floods do the purging work for them. But Enki, the rebel, the master geneticist who had perfected the art of the secret project, refused to obey the totalitarian decree of his brother. He devised a counterplan, a mission of salvation so clandestine that if discovered, it would surely mean his own immediate execution and exile. He sought out the most loyal of his human protégés, a man named Ziusudra, known later in other myths as Utnapishtim or Noah, a dedicated scribe and gardener who possessed an almost telepathic connection with his creator god. Enki appeared to Ziusudra in a dream, or perhaps a directed mental projection, bypassing the language barriers and the physical distance, and whispered the blueprint for survival directly into the human's terrified mind. This was not to be a simple wooden boat, the narrative exaggerated later. This was to be a technologically advanced submersible ark designed to withstand the crushing pressures and impossible turbulence of a planetary-scale gravitational shift and subsequent mega-tsunami. Ziusudra was commanded to build the vessel, not just for his family, but as a living genetic archive. He was to gather not just 2 of every animal, a charming misinterpretation of the task, but the genetic code, the very seed stock of all life on Earth, prepared and stored within cryogenic containers aboard the Ark. This Ark, known as the Magur Gurgur, was Enki's ultimate middle finger to his brother Enlil. It was a preservation chamber designed to save the biological diversity of Earth and, critically, the pure, uncorrupted genetic template of the original Adamu lineage. While Enlil prepared the evacuation of the Anunnaki command structure to the safest mountain peaks, leaving the doomed humans to their fate, Enki frantically oversaw the construction of the Magur Gurgur, using his remaining loyal Igigi engineers to aid Ziusudra under the cover of a massive gold storage facility construction project. The tension was unbearable. Every shudder of the ground, every violent electrical storm, was a reminder that the window for salvation was closing rapidly. The atmosphere was becoming thick with static energy. The sun was appearing strangely distorted in the sky, and the deep, seismic groaning of the planet signaled the arrival of the cosmic destroyer. When the final seals were welded and the last of the genetic archives secured, Enki gave the signal for Zu-Sudra to board. The air was heavy, still, and silent, the terrifying calm before the true storm unleashed by Nibiru's passage through the inner solar system. Then the horror began. It wasn't rain that signaled the start of the deluge. It was the catastrophic failure of the continental shelf, initiated by Nibiru's gravitational interference. The entire Persian Gulf region, the very heart of the Anunnaki's gold operation, began to buckle and sink. The oceans did not merely rise. They were violently hurled inland by colossal, mile-high tidal waves, driven by forces no earthly mechanism could explain. Fire and water mingled in a terrible symphony of destruction. The Anunnaki who had stayed low, those who had ignored the warnings, were swept away instantly, their technology crushed like tinfoil. Enlil watched from his fortified mountain base, horrified not just by the scale of the destruction, but by the dawning realization that he had been entirely correct. The destruction was absolute. But somewhere, deep beneath the churning, boiling planetary ocean, the Magur-Gurgur, the secret ark of Enki, was holding fast, a tiny beacon of defiance against the decree of the commander. Humanity, or at least its genetic potential, had survived the purge, saved by the very scientist who had created them, now secretly tucked away in a technological cradle, waiting for the devastating waters to recede and the new, terrifying age of Earth to begin. The silence was louder than the roaring deluge. It was the sound of a planet utterly scrubbed clean, a baptism by annihilation that had satisfied the terrifying, unforgiving rage of Lord Enlil. The arks, the great sky vessels of the Anunnaki, finally breached the sulphurous cloud layer, slicing through the perpetual gloom to survey the wreckage below, seeking proof that the abomination, the hybrid human worker, had truly been erased from existence. They landed on peaks that were once deep ocean floors, now desolate mudscapes stretching to an endless gray horizon. The sheer scale of the devastation was breathtaking, even to these cosmic engineers who had witnessed planetary collapse before. Yet the sight brought Enlil a cold satisfaction. The slate was wiped clean. But as the landing ramps lowered and the advanced seismic scanners began their sweep, the critical, horrifying realization hit the commander. The meticulously planned extermination had failed. There were faint, rhythmic energy signatures, traces of highly organized, protected biological life clustered in a single deep-water region that had miraculously survived the worst scouring. Enlil's golden eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now burning suns of pure, unadulterated fury. He saw the faint, telltale markings near the sheltered area, not the random detritus of a destroyed civilization, but the remnants of a highly sophisticated, sealed submersible craft, clearly bearing Enki's unique, unmistakable design signature. The betrayal was absolute, a cosmic defiance that threatened to shatter the fragile chain of command holding their entire desperate mission together. Enki, the brilliant chief scientist, had not only warned his creation, he had preserved them, sheltering a viable breeding population of Lulu right under Enlil's punishing deluge. This was treason of the highest order, an insult to the supreme authority of Nibiru, punishable by immediate, agonizing oblivion. Yet Enlil was paralyzed by a terrible dilemma that trumped even his monumental rage. He knew that even if he executed Enki, the core problem remained. Nibiru's distress signals were now growing frantic, echoing through the empty halls of the command center like a death knell in the void. The gold dust reserves, so painstakingly gathered before the flood, were now contaminated, scattered, or simply nowhere near enough to patch the planet's atmosphere before the deadline expired. The calculations were undeniable. Even after the purge, the Anunnaki still needed the very workforce Enlil had tried to drown. Their own numbers were dwindling rapidly, their lifespan on this toxic, chaotic post-flood planet drastically reduced by the uncontrolled magnetic field shifts and the sheer psychological strain of constant crisis. They could not possibly rebuild the gold recovery and processing infrastructure alone. They needed the fast-maturing, resilient, and utterly disposable hands of the Lulu. The need for gold superseded the desire for biological purity, creating a forced, agonizing pivot in the Anunnaki master plan.